Welcome to the RSPO Remediation and Compensation Procedure webinar. This is a series of webinars that the RSPO is hosting, and we are now at the third webinar that we've hosted for the year. Today we will be having our webinar on the topic Remediation and Compensation Procedure. This will be presented by Mr. Dylan Sarim from the RSPO Secretariat. Dylan has been with the RSPO for the last 3 years, and he has been actively involved in this topic very specifically. To an extent, we would consider him to be an expert on this topic. And we wanted to share this knowledge that he has with the rest of our members. We've had a lot of queries from members on this topic, so we thought it would be best to actually engage in a webinar to push out this knowledge. So without further ado, I will get Dylan to start on the webinar, but just a small housekeeping. All participants are on mute. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box. The webinar will be sent via an email and via the registration link to all registered participants post-webinar session. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Mr. Dylan.
Thank you, Rachmi. Hi, everyone. Good evening and good morning to everyone maybe who is joining the webinar from the other side of the world. So as introduced by Rachmi, I'm Dylan Sarim. I've been involved with the remediation and compensation procedure for at least 3 years right now. And today, I would like to share my knowledge on the remediation and compensation procedure. Thank you for registering for the webinar session with me. So for today, I will be covering this content. So I'll be explaining to you the background of the procedure, to whom this procedure applies, the key requirements of the procedure, basically the flowchart of how this procedure is completed, disclosure of non-compliant land clearance, the land use change analysis requirement, and finally how to meet the conservation liability by designing the compensation plan, and also manage and monitoring of the compensation procedure. I will start off with the background of the procedure. So the remediation and compensation procedure is required for any clearance since November 2005 without prior HCV assessment. So this clearance since November 2005 without prior HCV assessment is referred to as non-compliant land clearance. Why is the procedure necessary? So RSPO has this criterion 7.3, which states that new plantings since November 2005 have not replaced primary forest or any area required to maintain or enhance one or more HCV. So in order to, remediation and compensation procedure enables grower to resolve non-conformity related to criterion 7.3. So in order to get RSPO certified, growers with non-compliant land clearance will have to complete the remediation and compensation procedure. So to whom this procedure applies? So basically, the remediation and compensation procedure is a global application procedure. It applies to all RSPO grower members, both certified and non-certified, as well as growers seeking for RSPO membership. At the moment, this procedure is not applicable to independent smallholders. This is a basic flowchart on how the remediation and compensation procedure works. So briefly, it starts with disclosure of non-compliant land clearance. So it can either come from the disclosure itself, or it can be reported by certification body or a third party. And from there, the RSPO Secretariat will decide whether a LUCA or land use change analysis is required. If it's not required, the RSPO growers can proceed with certification. If LUCA is required, we will then contact the company to ask them to submit the land use change analysis, and from there we will identify whether the company has any final conservation liability. If there's no final conservation liability, the RSPO growers can proceed with certification. If there is final conservation liability, they will have to follow the rest of the procedure, which is to submit a concept note and finally compensation plan. So I'll be talking about each of the steps in detail right now. Let's start with the disclosure of non-compliant land clearance. Like I mentioned, non-compliant land clearance is the land clearance without prior RTB assessment since November 2005. And this picture over here shows you the list of documents available on the RSPO website. And for the disclosure, you will need to use Annex 2 of disclosure of non-compliant land clearance to fulfill the requirement. So disclosure of non-compliant land clearance for existing RSPO member, they should already disclose all non-compliant land clearance on land under their control. So under their control means it's owned, managed, leased, or acquired. For applicants for RSPO membership, they will have to disclose to RSPO any non-compliant land clearance or state in writing that no compliant land clearance exists. So this is during the RSPO membership application itself. So what happens if these two parties do not disclose the non-compliant land clearance to us? So existing RSPO members, if they don't disclose, and then later it is found by a third party, the case will be treated as a complaint case. It's no longer compensation case. For applicants of RSPO membership, the membership application will not be approved unless the land use change analysis has been submitted and reviewed. This is just to show you that when existing RSPO member disclose no non-compliant land clearance, it's the end of the procedure for them. So they can then proceed with the necessary preparation for RSPO certification. But if they disclose non-compliant land clearance, they will have to proceed with the submission of standard operating procedure or SOP, identify any potential social liability, and finally submit the land use change analysis. So briefly on SOPs, the SOP that the RSPO required is the SOP that is relevant to the new planting procedure, and this must be approved by senior management. It is required as an evidence to demonstrate that growers have now taken the appropriate measure to avoid further non-compliant land clearance in the future. There's two options of submitting the SOP. So the first option is to submit the entire SOP for public disclosure. The SOP will then be uploaded on the RSPO website. And option 2 is to get the certification body to verify the SOP, and then the letter, and then the CB will produce a letter that will be sent by the company to RSPO. For identification of social liability related to social HCV, so growers who reported non-compliant land clearance will also need to demonstrate that they have not overlooked their obligation to maintain and enhance social HCV. And evidences such as the EIA, FPIC, or participatory mapping will be needed to ensure that growers have checked for any potential social liability in that unit. So now I'll be talking about the land use change analysis requirement. For the land use change analysis, these are the two documents from the RSPO website that you will need to use. The Annex 5, which is the reporting template for land use change analysis, and also the reporting checklist table for the land use change. LUCA is required for all management units with non-compliant land clearance. To give you an example, so basically management unit A reported non-compliant land clearance, so LUCA is required. Management unit B disclosed no non-compliant land clearance, so the LUCA is not required. Management unit C, non-compliant land clearance, yes. LUCA, yes. I'll now take you to the 4 factors affecting the final conservation liability. So the first one will be the vegetation coefficient. The second one will be the period of clearance. The third one will be the membership status at the time of clearance. And finally, the type of clearance. Let's go to the first factor, which is the vegetation coefficient. This is very important to note that the November 2005 land cover information is the baseline to calculate the final conservation liability. Each land cover has its own vegetation coefficient, which serve as proxy to the HB 1, 2, and 3. On the vegetation coefficient, basically coefficient 1 is your structurally complex forest with uneven or multi-layered canopy. In layman's term, this is referred to as primary forest. Coefficient 0.7 is your structurally simplified or degraded forest with even or single layered canopy, or we can refer to them as secondary forest. Coefficient 0.4 is your multi-species agroforestry. And finally, coefficient 0, which is, for example, your shrubland or your bare land. The next factor is the period of non-compliant land clearance. So the first period is November 2005 to November 2007. This is when the first RSPO PNC is trialed. The second period is December 2007 to December 2009, where the first RSPO certification was issued. And then 1st Jan 2010 to 9th May 2014 is when the NPP was introduced. And finally, after 9th May 2014, which was the date of the introduction of the remediation and compensation procedure. It is also important to note that period of non-compliant land clearance ends after the HB assessment is completed. So for example, HB assessment is completed in 2010, January 2010, yeah? So the period of non-compliant land clearance is from November 2005 until January 2010. The next factor will be the RSPO membership status. So as you can see, you will see two columns. The first column is the land controlled by a non-member at the time of clearance. And then the second column on your right is the land controlled by RSPO member at the time of clearance. Yeah. And then the final factor will be the type of clearance. Corporate clearance is identified as any land cleared for plantations or facilities built directly and exclusively to support oil palm plantation. The non-corporate clearance is clearance for other than corporate purposes, including government projects, local communities with no external funding. Companies are not expected to compensate for non-corporate clearance. So the land use change analysis will determine the final conservation liability based on the first four factors. So it determines the scale of conservation project which must be undertaken for the grower to meet the RSPO compensation liability to proceed with RSPO certification. The land use change analysis also allows RSPO to identify any remediation requirement. So for this example, you can see that riparian zones are planted with oil palm. This is the shapefile submitted during the land use change analysis. And this is how we identify the remediation requirement. So final conservation liability matrix table. As you can see, if you move to the right, from non-member to member, the compensation will be heavier. And as we go from November 2005 to 9th May 2014, the compensation will be heavier as well. It is also important to note that in every period, social and environmental remediation is required. The RSPO is also giving the opportunity for companies to opt for not doing land use change analysis. So growers who are not willing to compensate, growers who are not doing land use change analysis will have to compensate the total clearance using coefficient 1. And just for your information, the summary of the land use change analysis report shall be part of the summary of the compensation plan, which will then be made public. I will bring you now to the concept note submission. Just to briefly elaborate on the option for meeting conservation liability. So we have two options. Option 1 is hectare to hectare, where, for example, you have from the land use change analysis, you have 100 hectare final conservation liability. You will need to find elsewhere in situ or ex situ same amount of hectare to compensate. Option 2, which is the hectare to dollar. So 1 hectare is equivalent to $2,500 US. Compensation must be done in addition to the environmental and social remediation, as per my previous slide. In terms of the priority of the compensation project, the RSPO will prefer the compensation project to be an off-site avoided deforestation of high quality habitats. And the least preferred project will be on-site forest high quality habitat re-establishment. It's also important to note that for every concept not submitted, it will be evaluated by the compensation panel using these 4 criteria, which is additional, long-lasting, equitable, and knowledge-based. This criteria is explained further in Annex 6 of the procedure. To briefly tell you what additional is, I guess it's better for me to give you an example of proposal to meet each criteria. So additional, for example, if you have 100 hectare of final conservation liability, in order to be additional, you can then propose to double the amount of final conservation liability. So from 100, you will propose to compensate for 200. So that is considered additional. Long lasting, the project should last at least 25 years, but there are some instances where the compensation project is already ongoing and then the lifespan is only, for example, 15 years. The company must demonstrate that the impact from the compensation project will last at least another 10 more years to meet the 25 years criteria requirement. For the equitable, basically this is where you will have to speak to every stakeholder that is impacted by the compensation project. And finally, knowledge base is to get the local knowledge from the local community, and also to base the compensation project on sound scientific knowledge. So the compensation concept note is to be submitted to the compensation panel via the RSPO Secretariat. The compensation panel will verify and review the concept note, and then the results of the review will be shared with the company by the RSPO Secretariat. So the important document on concept note submission will be Annex 7, which you can find in the RSPO website. And finally, we go to the compensation plan submission. The compensation plan must address the on-site remediation managed in accordance to the BMPs as per the RSPO PNC, adequate compensation for loss of social HCV, and how the compensation project meets the 4 criteria. For your information, the compensation plan will be sent for an independent review process at the expense of the grower. And the document that explains the compensation plan is Annex 8, which is also the template for you to fill in when submitting the compensation plan. Once the compensation plan is endorsed, the RSPO member may proceed with certification. And as mentioned, a summary of the approved compensation plan will be made publicly available on the RSPO website. All right, in terms of monitoring and implementation, Growers implementing the compensation plan shall provide an annual progress report following a standard reporting template. So this template is still work in progress by the BHB working group. Failure to implement the approved compensation plan will be considered as a complaint and reported to the complaints panel. In terms of monitoring, for off-site compensation plan, monitoring is done on annual basis by either the company or a third party implementing the compensation plan. So this is usually using option 2, which is the hectare to dollar compensation mechanism. For certified units, the annual reporting will be done via the annual audits by certification bodies. For non-certified units, independent evaluators will be used for year 1 of the implementation, and for every 5 years after that, the independent evaluator will go to the ground and evaluate the implementation of the monitor. So if you have any question, you can always contact us at rspcompensation@rspo.org, and this is the link to the procedure, documents, and annexes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for a very wonderful presentation. I hope you guys were able to comprehend a lot of stuff. We know this is not a very easy topic, hence which is why we have decided to do the webinar. And we have a lot of questions coming in right now, and we will try to respond to all the queries that we have here, failing which you could please write into the email that Dylan has displayed earlier to rspcocompensation@rspo.org. So Dylan, I know you probably would have covered some of this, but we did have some latecomers into the webinar. So one question that we have here is, when is LUCA required and not required?
So the land use change analysis is required if the company disclosed non-compliant land clearance. Non-compliant land clearance is clearance that is done prior since November 2005 without a prior HB assessment.
Okay, so you spoke about participatory mapping. There's questions about participatory mapping. Would you be able to expand on your recent slide that you spoke about it?
All right. The participatory mapping is actually a requirement under the identification of social liability, potential social liability. Basically, participatory mapping is an evidence that is required by the compensation panel to ensure that the company has taken step to consult all the local communities without before they even plan the development. So if the development is in November 2005 to November 2007, usually participatory mapping is most of the time it's not conducted. So I mean, but if it's the development occurred in 2010, for example, most of the time a participatory mapping is already been conducted by the company. So this the evidence of this participatory mapping needs to be shared to the RSPO Secretariat so that the compensation panel is made aware the company has done this to consult the local communities before they even develop the area.
So you're speaking about social liability, right? So do you only refer to social HCVs? But what about lost livelihood, dislocation, etc., etc.? So is there a way to define the compensation based on those impacts?
That's a very tough question, I have to admit. Okay, if I'm not sure if I'm able to answer you on point, but this potential social liability is only referring to the loss of HCV 4, 5, and 6. So in terms of community displacement, I'm not sure in which HCV does community displacement is covered in. So I may not be able to answer you right now. Maybe you should write to me, and then we will do more research and give a definite answer for you.
Okay, so talking about companies earlier, okay, we say that companies do not have to compensate for previously cleared land. Now, what if these companies actually use small holders, right? And small holders and local farmers to clear the land, and then after that they acquire that land. What checks and balances are in place to guard against this from happening?
Okay, to be honest, the remediation and compensation procedure is designed to trust all the disclosure that is made by the company. So when we ask companies to disclose the non-compliant land clearance to us, we really we believe what is being disclosed by the company. So in the case where the company is not telling the truth, not disclosing properly, the CB will be our police on the ground to check on whether the disclosure made is valid or not. So they will be able to identify and also maybe connect the missing link that the RSPO Secretariat is not aware of.
So what kind of external compensation mechanisms will the RSPO endorse for growers to engage with? So, you know, should they not have the capacity to manage certification and compensation themselves?
I don't quite get your question.
So is there an external compensation mechanism that, you know, we as RSPO endorse, or is this the only compensation mechanism that we actually approve of? So what if there's a separate one and then we endorse it and then we say, okay, if you're not using the RSPO RaCP guidance and procedure, is there something else that you would accept? Okay, this basically for the growers who probably do not have the capacity to manage certification and compensation themselves.
So at the moment, the RSPO is the only scheme operator that that is doing remediation compensation procedure. So basically, there are no other guidelines for you to do your compensation. It's only the remediation compensation procedure.
So here's an interesting question. Some people will always break the rules. So if the fines are heavier for RSPO members than non-members, what encouragement is there for non-member growers to join? I'm actually trying to be very partial here. We're trying to answer as many questions as possible, but this is quite a on the fence question. So Dylan?
So the question is, if the member is penalized more than non-members, why non-members? How is this an encouragement for for people to apply for RSPO membership? Is that correct? Okay, to be honest, I also do not have the question, but I mean, if a grower company believes in sustainability, they will join RSPO, and they will be obligated to fulfill the remediation compensation procedure. That is what I have to say with this question.
Thank you. Okay, so here's one thing. I think we've had similar questions like this in the past as well. So there is an opinion where they feel that hectarage to dollar approach will encourage rich multilateral companies to clear primary forests. So there is a feeling that $2,500 per hectare is not deterrent enough.
Okay, so for existing member, if you look closely on the final conservation liability metrics, if the company is already a member of RSPO after 9th May 2014 and they still cleared area without prior HCV assessment, they will get expelled from RSPO. Yeah. And usually this is a real life situation when a grower company applied for RSPO membership, they will come to RSPO Secretariat to analyze whether their liability and whether it is worth to join RSPO with such a huge amount of compensation liability. Okay, I don't know whether that answers your question, but like for existing member, if you cleared area without prior HB assessment since after 9th May 2014, you get expelled. That is already like a warning to RSPO members to not clear area without HB assessment.
So Dylan, for those who actually do compensate, right, what is the development from that compensation? Where does it go? What happens with it? The money?
Sorry, if I understand that question correctly, so if you are opting for option 2, where does the money go? All right, the RSPO Secretariat will not accept any money from the compensation. So usually this is if the company opt for option 2, hectare to dollar, the company needs to find a third party, usually a third party that conduct conservation project, and then channel that compensation money to the compensation project.
Okay, so here's a question that came in. What is the position of RaCP with NPP? After or before?
I would say that what is the position? Okay, so remediation and compensation procedure, it applies retrospectively. So as you can see, we also analyze land clearance from November 2005 to November 2007, whereas the NPP only come in January 2010. Yeah. So any clearance after January 2010 for existing member, we are already expecting you to conduct the new planting procedure. If you do not conduct the new planting procedure, you will then need to first compensate, and then the NPP sanction will be applied to the area cleared.
How is a declaration of no non-compliant land clearing verified?
All right, this is heavily discussed in the BHB working group, and then the working group actually agreed that the CB will have to go to the ground and then verify whether the disclosure is done correctly.
Can you clarify compensation on riparian? So the land hectare to hectare does not need similarly riparian. It can be any dry land away from waterway.
Okay, so I think I need to make this clear that if you clear riparian area, you are subjected to both compensation and remediation. So you will have to remediate that cleared riparian areas, restore it to its original condition, and also compensate the clearance made. Yep. Sorry, what was the question? Is that sufficient to answer the question? Okay, yeah.
Okay, again talking about compensation, are companies permitted to use ongoing conservation efforts as additional or to be considered as compensation?
Okay, so for ongoing compensation project, companies can definitely ask the third party to help construct a concept note and submit to the RSPO Secretariat for the compensation panel review. In terms of meeting the additionality criterion, whatever the company is proposing in terms of activities must be above and beyond whatever the project, the activity of the project. So, for example, the project has already planned to have like this set of activity. So, in terms of meeting the additionality, the company must provide more activities so that additional outcome can be reached.
So this may require some clarification as well, because we have a question here that says liability will end once HCV assessment is completed. The term completed refers to the date of assessment of date of the report approved by ALS.
I would say the BHP working group also debated very heavily on this. So they decide that the date of the HCV assessment is the date when the HCV map is finalized.
Okay. Can you explain a bit about the difference between environmental compensation plan and the conservational conservation plan and why they're actually separated?
Okay, so I believe I don't mention anything environmental compensation plan or the other conservational plan, but I mean, yeah, there's no such thing as there's no two different plans. It's only the compensation plan.
So here's a question on unused lands. So if a company acquires it with its land title but cannot relinquish, in this case, those lands hold HCV4 intact forest landscape. How do they deal with this?
How is this about question about management of HCV or how to deal with how to deal in terms of compensating it? So
On compensation.
On compensation. So if I assume that if it's already in compensation, meaning that the area is already cleared, yeah. So you will just need to follow the normal procedure, which is to calculate the final conservation liability and compensate it either using the option 1 or option 2.
What if it's on HCV?
Okay, so the idea of the remediation and compensation procedure and the proxy approach to it is that the working group and also RSPO believe that any land cleared without prior HCV assessment is assumed as potential HCV. Yeah. So so that's why we are. Yeah, I mean, companies are required to compensate for it because everything is assumed to be an HCV.
So after listening to all this, we've had an attendee asking this question about, can we externalize the management of those lands through compensation procedure to another conservation body rather than doing it ourselves as palm oil producer? Bearing in mind, it has nothing to do with their activity as a palm oil producer. Can this jeopardize the certification process?
So if I understand that correctly, it's basically if you have compensation liability, you then channel that liability to a third party to be responsible for doing all the conservation work. Is that what it is? Yeah. I would say that it's possible. So basically, you are opting for either option 1 or option 2. So let's take an example of option 2. So you convert your final conservation liability to dollar figure, and then you channel that money into that conservation project. In terms of whether it will impact your certification, so when you are certified, after you complete all the compensation plan and also the remediation compensation procedure, you will have to produce a monitoring report annually for the compensation panel to review. If the monitoring report suggests that you are not doing the plan, whatever is planned, you are not executing whatever you have planned, it can affect your certification.
So this is not so much of a question, but more of an opinion, and we could ask Dylan for his opinion as well. So many non-members have cleared land after November 2005, some even after 2010, without being aware of RSPO requirements. In light of NDPE policies in the recent years and efforts of refiners to communicate values to their suppliers, some of these non-members are considering RSPO membership. Compensation is a huge turnoff for these growers that wish to remain relevant in the market. What are your thoughts, Dylan?
I guess if you want to practice sustainability and you will just you will not question about the value of the compensation. I mean, in terms of dollar figure, you will. I guess if they want to really be sustainable, they will have to join RSPO and do. I mean, perform sustainability after that.
Okay. Thank you, Dylan. Well, I have another question here, which is quite relevant to an earlier question. We have a question here to say, who is monitoring the conservation projects, and is there any published reports?
Okay, as you can see from my slide just now, Annex 9 is still work in progress. So in terms of who is monitoring, so I can say that I can say that for a certified company, the CB will be monitoring all the compensation plan implementation. Okay, let me just go to the slide. All right, yeah, for certified company, certified units, so annual reporting will be done by the annual audit by certification body. And also for non-certified unit, independent evaluators will be used for year 1 of the implementation and every 5 years subsequent to until the end of the implementation period. So for the second scenario, non-certified unit, usually after the company completes the RSCP, they will opt for certification. So in terms of monitoring, it will still be done annually by the CB, provided that they are certified.
So how many companies to date has voluntarily participated in this RACP?
Okay, disclosure is at 100%. And then for growers applying for RSPO membership, they will firstly need to disclose any non-compliant clearance. So in terms of participation, it's at 100%.
I think we have another clarification question here from a latecomer. If you buy a new land, you have to compensate for the past management of deforestation?
Yes.
Will the company necessarily be expelled when LUCA results showed the company has done land clearance after May 2014 and didn't conduct HCV as yet? Or may compensation panel have some stages to proceed with the expulsion?
All right. So before the company is expelled, the compensation panel will deliberate on the using the land use change analysis as their guidance. So it's not usually if you cleared area after May 9, 2014, you get expelled. The compensation panel will look at other evidences and also consider what are the reasons, the valid reasons to the clearance.
How does RSPO justify compensation liability and its requirement when half the total production of CSPO is being physically uptake?
I'm very sorry, but I can't answer that question right now.
Thank you. Here's a question that keeps coming up, and I know RSPO is looking into this, but you could probably clarify further. What is the status of RACP for independent smallholders? Any specific requirement going forward? And what's the status for RACP independent smallholders?
So, like I mentioned in the presentation just now, the current remediation compensation procedure is not applicable to independent smallholders. So at the, I think it was in March, at that March BOG meeting, the BOG has agreed on an interim measure for independent smallholders in terms of RSCP. So basically what was agreed is that a task force will be set up to come up with the RSCP for independent smallholders. But in the meantime, as interim measure, independent smallholders can still get certified provided that they completed the disclosure as well as the land use change analysis process. You may ask that how can independent smallholders complete the land use change analysis because they do not have capacity. So the RSPO has taken the initiative to assist them financially and also technically. So basically the land use change analysis will be done by the RSPO Secretariat. So in terms of update on the task force, the task force is planning to meet up in the coming months and to discuss on how remediation and compensation procedure is going to be applied to independent smallholders. But for now, they can be certified.
Okay. RaCP has options to design over a plan of environmental remediation, 5.3 RaCP document. But there is also 5.3 option to comply conservation responsibly. Why are they separated? This question came from Daniel. Daniel, if you're also listening, you mentioned that Dylan did not answer the remediation must be prohibited place or elsewhere. If you could clarify on that and send in the question, it will be helpful. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm reading your question again because I don't understand the question. Okay, so compensation and remediation are two different things. Yeah, you are required to remediate any clearance on RSPO prohibited areas, and at the same time, if the land use change analysis found out that you have 100 hectares of final conservation liability, you will have to design the conservation or the compensation plan. So in the compensation plan, both the remediation and the compensation must be addressed. So that's make up 5.2 and 5.3. It's two totally different things. One is remediation requirement, and the other is the compensation itself.
How is the declaration of no non-compliant land clearing verified?
I believe that this question has been asked, and my answer to that again is the CB role to verify whether the disclosure has been made. Basically, I mean, the disclosure is valid or not. So basically, the way it is, for example, the company wants to go for a certification. So usually they will send a public announcement, and then from our side we will check whether the company has no non-compliant land clearance or whether they are involved in the remediation and compensation procedure. If usually what we tell the CB is that they can proceed if the non-compliant land clearance is 0, but we note to them that they will have to verify this on the ground.
What is the NPP function in terms of remediation and compensation procedure?
So companies like to relate NPP and remediation and compensation procedure, but it's actually two different procedure. But in a way, it can be related. If you do not do your NPP, it can mean that you do not conduct your HCB assessment, and that will lead to if you clear that area, and that will lead to remediation and compensation procedure.
Considering the $2,500 per hectareage compensation approach, how will the company manage financially if the area to compensate exceeds 30,000 hectares of land? Can the company apply for the hectare-to-hectare process?
Yes, the company is allowed to apply for any options that they think best for their compensation project.
That pretty much, Dylan, covers all the questions. We have received a lot of comments as well, not questions. Take a note. We just want to clarify that the RSPO is working towards transforming palm oil to be sustainable palm oil to be the norm, and there is a lot of challenge, and this is one that we have actually developed, and as we progress we are looking at many aspects of how we can progress further. As one of the things that Dylan mentioned was also the smallholders, which we are looking very actively right now. But we are unable to comment to a lot of these things because they were not questions, they were actually comments. But having said that, we still have a little bit of time, and I think we can take one last question. Dylan, the CB is required to report the compensation progress. However, which indicator is best to report it?
This is the first time I get asked this question, so I'm not sure whether my answer will be is the best answer. But I guess in terms of indicator, it will be 7.3.1 because that is when the RSCP comes into place, and it's that 7.3.1.
Okay, thank you, Dylan. We have actually very successfully answered all questions. Having that we will not be receiving any more questions, I thank all the attendees to be part of this webinar. We really appreciate all of you all being here and learning how the RSCP procedure works. Thank you very much, Dylan, for your time and for a lot of your explanation. I know this is a very, very challenging topic, which is why we constantly have questions coming in, and we wanted to do this webinar to explain to everybody how does the procedure actually work. Just as a housekeeping note, this webinar will be emailed to all registered participants, and Dylan's presentation will be shared as well post this webinar. So thank you very much again for your time, and we will meet you at the next webinar. Thank you.